The sky above New Lyra was a kaleidoscope of fragmented light, a perpetual aurora born from the orbital remains of the Starforge. Scattered pieces of the once mighty construct glinted in the planet's weak sunlight, their edges sharp as broken dreams. From the observation deck of the Institute of Stellar Ethics, Joran Idris could see the jagged debris belt. It wrapped around the planet like a noose, a grim reminder of what humanity had been forced to abandon. Joran pressed his palm against the cold, transparent dome that separated him from the void. Legacy, he muttered under his breath, the word sour on his tongue. He had grown up hearing it in every story, in every textbook that dared to chronicle humanity's past without the Concord's interference. Legacy was the promise they had been sold, the shining thread connecting them to the ancestors who had wielded the Starforge. But now, legacy was shackles. He glanced at the holographic chronometer hovering nearby. He had 30 minutes until the tribunal convened, 30 minutes to gather his thoughts and steel himself against the storm waiting in the Concord Hall of Judgments. As the youngest envoy ever chosen to represent humanity, Joran was acutely aware of the weight he carried. He had been told he was brilliant, exceptional, a prodigy in diplomacy and rhetoric. But brilliance didn't dull the ache of responsibility. Behind him, a faint chime signaled an incoming transmission. The voice of his advisor, Dr. Amira Tellen, crackled into the room. "Joran, you're still in the observatory? You should be reviewing the counterarguments." "I've memorized them," Joran replied without turning. "Every clause, every loophole, every rhetorical angle. It's not going to matter." The Concord made up its mind the moment they issued the ban. "Then why are we here?" Amira's voice was tight with frustration, though not at him. "Why did you agree to stand before them if you believe it's hopeless?" Joran turned, his sharp features illuminated by the shifting light of the aurora. "Because we have to make them see. Even if they refuse to acknowledge it today, someone will remember. Someday, they'll realize they were wrong." Amira sighed, a sound heavy with the fatigue of years spent fighting an unyielding bureaucracy. "The tribunal isn't about truth, Joran. It's about control. They don't fear what we've done, they fear what we might do if we reclaim the Forge." The Forge. Even in his own thoughts, Joran capitalized the word, as though it were a deity demanding reverence. And in a way, it had been. Before the ban, the Starforge had been humanity's answer to a dying universe. It could summon stars from barren gas clouds, stabilize collapsing orbits, and terraform worlds into verdant paradises. It was creation incarnate, wielded by hands still trembling from the memory of Earth's near extinction. But the Concord had called it hubris. They accused humanity of playing gods, of disrupting the fragile equilibrium of the cosmos. The ban had been swift and uncompromising, and when humanity resisted, the Starforge was dismantled under the Concord's watchful eye. Its fragments now orbited New Lyra, a graveyard in the stars. Joran strode to the console embedded in the wall and keyed in a command. The display lit up with schematics of the Starforge, its intricate mechanisms rendered in ghostly blue light. He traced a finger along the diagram, his thoughts spiraling. "Did you know," he said aloud, "that the Forge once reignited a dying star in the Onyx Quadrant? The Concord was ready to evacuate 3 systems, but we stabilized it in less than a day. They called it a miracle. And now they pretend it never happened." Amira was silent for a moment. When she spoke, her tone was gentler. "Joran, the Concord fears us because we proved we don't need them. That terrifies them more than any star we've forged." He clenched his jaw, frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. "And what terrifies me is the thought of a galaxy where the weak are left to die because the Concord won't intervene." The chimes sounded again, this time signaling the arrival of his transport. Joran took a deep breath and straightened his uniform, a sleek black and silver ensemble adorned with the insignia of humanity's envoy corps. The weight of it pressed against his shoulders, but he welcomed the pressure. It reminded him that he carried more than his own ambitions into the tribunal. "Amira," he said, his voice steadier now, "I'm going to make them remember. Even if it's the last thing I do." The tribunal chamber was a monolithic structure carved from obsidian and veined with threads of bioluminescent crystal. The architecture seemed designed to intimidate, each pillar and archway a silent declaration of the Concord's dominion. Joran walked through the grand entrance with his head held high, his boots clicking against the polished floor. The delegates of the Concord were already seated in the crescent-shaped gallery. Each species had its representative, their forms as varied as the stars themselves. The Arcanth with their iridescent exoskeletons, the Othran who shimmered like living shadows, and the Lumadara whose translucent bodies pulsed with internal light, all watched him with unblinking intensity. At the center of the gallery sat Chancellor Vorek, a towering figure whose golden scales caught the chamber's glow. His voice, deep and resonant, filled the space. "Envoy Idris of New Lyra, you may begin." Joran stepped into the circle of light at the chamber's center, his heart pounding but his expression composed. He scanned the faces of the delegates, searching for cracks in their united front. "Esteemed members of the Concord," he began, his voice clear and measured, "I stand before you not as a petitioner, but as a witness. A witness to the consequences of fear and the price of forsaking progress." The chamber fell silent. Even the faint hum of the bioluminescent veins seemed to dim, as though the room itself held its breath. Joran continued, his tone growing stronger with each word. "The ban on the Starforge was not an act of justice. It was an act of suppression. You feared what humanity might become if left unbound, and so you shackled us. But in doing so, you condemned countless worlds to needless suffering." A ripple of unease passed through the gallery. Joran caught a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye, a Lumadara delegate shifting uncomfortably in their seat. He seized the moment. "Consider this," he said, his gaze sweeping across the assembly. "Since the ban, how many dying systems have you left untouched? How many civilizations have crumbled while you debated the ethics of intervention? The Starforge was not a weapon, it was a lifeline. And you cut it." His words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something in Chancellor Vorek's expression, hesitation perhaps or doubt. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Joran knew the odds were against him. He knew the Concord's decision was likely set in stone. But as he stood there, defying the weight of their judgment, he felt something stir within him. It wasn't hope exactly, but something stronger, resolve. The Concord arrived faster than anyone had anticipated. Their fleet, a glimmering armada of crescent-shaped ships, cut through the void with a precision that spoke of centuries of practice. Their flagship, the Etherean, dwarfed even the largest vessels in humanity's convoy. Its presence alone was a message. Surrender was not optional. Eleanor watched from the Starforge's command deck as the Concord's envoy appeared on the holoscreen. It was High Arbiter Kael'Tverin, a tall, willowy figure with silvery skin that shimmered like quicksilver. His voice was calm but carried an edge that made Eleanor's spine stiffen. "Dr. Varesh," he began, inclining his head slightly. "You have been warned. The Starforge is a violation of natural law, an affront to the balance the Concord has maintained for eons. We implore you one last time, stand down and dismantle your creation." Eleanor stepped forward, her expression resolute. "High Arbiter, the Starforge is not a weapon. It's a tool for renewal, for creation. It has already saved countless lives and could save countless more." Kael's gaze hardened. "Intent does not absolve consequence. Power of this magnitude in the hands of any one species is an existential threat. If you refuse to comply, we will take action." "And if we comply?" Eleanor countered. "What guarantee do we have that humanity will be left to thrive? Or will the Concord impose further sanctions, dismantling every innovation we've made?" Kael's silence was answer enough. The transmission ended, leaving the command deck in a tense hush. Eleanor exhaled slowly, her mind racing. The Concord had drawn their line in the sand, and now it was up to her to decide whether to cross it. Preparations for departure accelerated. Engineers worked around the clock to outfit the Starforge and its fleet with additional defenses. Supplies were rationed, and families were hurried aboard transport ships. Despite the urgency, whispers of doubt spread among the crew. Could they really escape the Concord? Was the Starforge worth the risk? Eleanor tried to address their fears, holding briefings and answering questions, but the strain was beginning to show. The sleepless nights and relentless pressure etched lines into her face, and her voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Even Dax, her steadfast ally, began to question their chances. "We're outnumbered and outgunned," he said during a late-night meeting in the tactical room. "The Concord isn't just a fleet, it's an idea. They've convinced the galaxy that we're the villains. How do we fight that?" Eleanor's reply was quiet but firm. "We don't fight their narrative. We survive long enough to prove it wrong." The first skirmish came 3 days later. A Concord patrol ship, faster and more maneuverable than anything humanity could field, intercepted the fleet near the edge of the Sirius expanse. The Starforge's escort ships moved to engage, but the battle was brief and brutal. 2 human vessels were destroyed before the Concord ship retreated, likely to report their location. In the aftermath, the mood aboard the Starforge darkened. The loss of life weighed heavily on Eleanor, and she spent hours reviewing the battle footage, searching for any tactical advantage they could exploit. But the reality was inescapable: they were outmatched. The council convened again, this time with tempers running high. Admiral Thorne was livid. "We can't keep running," he growled. "We need to take the fight to them. And get obliterated in the process?" Rhea shot back. "Our only chance is to keep moving, to stay ahead of them." "For how long?" Thorne demanded. "Until we're picked off one by one? This isn't survival, it's a slow death." Eleanor listened to the arguments, her hands clenched into fists beneath the table. Finally she stood, her voice cutting through the chaos. Enough. We're not here to debate what we can't change. The Concord will come for us again, and we need to be ready. That means finding a way to level the playing field. And how do you propose we do that? Thorne asked, his tone skeptical. Eleanor hesitated, then said, the Forge. The room fell silent. Ria's eyes narrowed. What are you suggesting? The Starforge was designed to create, Eleanor said. But its systems can be adapted. If we focus its energy output, we could create a defensive barrier, something strong enough to repel their ships. And the risks? Ria pressed. Uncertain, Eleanor admitted. But if we don't try, we'll lose everything. The council debated late into the night, but in the end, Eleanor's plan was approved. The Forge's engineers began the modifications immediately, working under an oppressive deadline. Every hour brought the Concord closer, and every failure felt like a nail in their coffin. 2 days later, the Concord returned. This time, it was not a lone patrol ship but an entire strike force. The Etherian led the charge, its weapons charging as it closed the distance. The Starforge's fleet scrambled to intercept, buying precious minutes for Eleanor's team to complete the final adjustments. Energy levels at 90%, a technician called out. Just a few more minutes. Eleanor stood at the center of the control room, her hands gripping the console. The weight of every life in the fleet pressed down on her shoulders. She glanced at Dax, who nodded grimly. We've got this, he said. Outside, the battle raged. Human ships darted through the void, outmaneuvered but tenacious. Explosions blossomed like dying stars, each one a reminder of the cost of defiance. On the main screen, Eleanor watched as the Etherian unleashed a barrage of energy blasts, tearing through their defenses. It's ready, the technician shouted. Eleanor didn't hesitate. Activate the Forge. The Starforge hummed to life, its energy fields crackling with raw power. A blinding wave of light erupted from its core, spreading outward in a shimmering dome. The Concord's ships faltered as the barrier enveloped them, their weapons useless against its brilliance. For the first time, the fleet had a chance to breathe. But the victory was bittersweet. The barrier was a temporary measure, draining the Forge's reserves with every passing second. Eleanor knew they couldn't hold it forever. As the Concord regrouped, she stared at the display, her mind already racing for the next solution. The journey was far from over, and the cost of survival was only beginning to reveal itself. The barrier had held longer than anyone expected, but the Forge's core was nearing critical levels. Sparks flew from overloaded consoles, and alarms blared through the Starforge as Eleanor barked orders, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Dax was at her side, his face pale but determined. They're regrouping for another assault, he said, pointing to the tactical display. The Etherian loomed at the center of the Concord's formation, its weapons glowing ominously. The next attack will break the barrier. Then we won't wait for it, Eleanor replied. Her gaze fixed on the Forge's readouts, a desperate plan forming in her mind. We'll take the fight to them. What are you saying? Dax asked, though he already knew the answer. The Forge has one last burst of power left, she said. We channel it directly into the Etherian. If we overload their flagship, the rest of their fleet might stand down. Dax hesitated. You're talking about a suicide run. Not if we time it perfectly, Eleanor countered. We'll use the fleet to draw their fire, open a path. The Forge is our only chance. For a moment, Dax's resolve wavered. Then he nodded. I'll rally the ships. The fleet moved into position, a ragged line of battered vessels standing against the Concord's superior firepower. Every captain knew the odds, but not a single ship hesitated. They were fighting for more than survival, they were fighting for the right to exist. Eleanor took her place at the Forge's helm, her hands steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. The core's energy surged, a brilliant inferno that lit up the void. As the fleet engaged the Concord, the Starforge powered forward, a lone titan amidst the chaos. The Etherian responded immediately, its weapons focusing on the approaching threat. Blasts of energy slammed into the barrier, each one weakening it further. Inside the Forge, the temperature climbed, and the air grew thick with tension. Core at 120% capacity, a technician reported, his voice trembling. We can't hold this much longer. We won't have to, Eleanor said, her eyes locked on the target. Prepare for the pulse. The Concord's ships closed in, desperate to stop the Starforge's advance. Human vessels sacrificed themselves to shield the Forge, their captain's final acts etched into the fabric of history. The Forge pushed onward, its systems groaning under the strain. Finally, the Etherian was within range. Eleanor activated the pulse, unleashing the Forge's remaining energy in a focused beam of light. The blast struck the Etherian with devastating force, piercing its shields and igniting its core. For a moment, the flagship hung in space, its silver hull glowing like a dying star. Then it exploded, a blinding cascade of fire and debris. The shockwave rippled through the battlefield, scattering the Concord's fleet. Their formation broke, and many ships began to retreat. On board the Forge, cheers erupted as the remaining human vessels regrouped. But Eleanor's relief was short-lived. The Forge's systems were failing, its core destabilizing beyond repair. "Evacuate the Forge," she ordered, her voice calm despite the looming disaster. "Get everyone to the escape pods." Dax appeared at her side. "You're coming too." Eleanor shook her head. "The Forge needs a pilot to guide it away from the fleet. If it goes critical here, we'll lose everything." Dax's jaw tightened. "There has to be another way." "This is my responsibility," she said softly. "I built the Forge. I'll see it through." Before he could argue, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Take care of them, Dax. Humanity needs you more than it needs me." The escape pods launched as the Forge drifted away from the fleet. Eleanor stood alone on the command deck, her gaze fixed on the stars. The core's light grew brighter, a blazing testament to everything they had fought for. As the Forge reached a safe distance, Eleanor activated the final sequence. The core erupted in a brilliant supernova, its energy consuming the remnants of the Concord's strike force. The battlefield fell silent, the void reclaiming its stillness. On board the escape pods, the survivors watched the explosion with a mix of sorrow and awe. Eleanor's sacrifice had saved them, but the cost was immeasurable. Dax clenched his fists, vowing to honor her memory by ensuring humanity's survival. Years later, the story of the Starforge became legend. On a distant world, a statue of Eleanor Varesh stood tall, her gaze turned skyward. Beneath it, an inscription read, "For the right to dream, for the courage to create." And among the stars, humanity thrived, carrying forward the legacy of the Forge and the woman who gave everything to protect it.